When I picked up my kids from my mother's house, my 6-year-old said, "Grandma says you're not our real mommy." My daughter Lily was crying, and my 4-year-old son James was holding her hand looking confused, while my mother stood behind them with that satisfied smile she always had when she'd done something cruel. "What did you tell them?" I knelt down to hug my kids, but Lily pulled away from me. "Grandma showed us pictures of our other mommy, the one who made us in her tummy. She said that's our real mommy, not you." My mother crossed her arms, looking proud of herself. "They deserve to know the truth. You've been lying to them for years." I had never lied to my children. We'd planned to tell them about their adoption when they were old enough to understand it properly with the help of a child psychologist who specialized in adoption. They knew they were special and chosen, but the full details were supposed to come later. "Mom, you had no right." She laughed, and it was sharp. "No right? I'm their grandmother. Their only real blood relative in this family, since you couldn't have children of your own." She said it loud enough for the kids to hear. James looked up at me. "Are we not your kids?" His voice was so small and broken I wanted to scream at my mother, but I had to stay calm for them. "You are absolutely my kids, forever and always." My mother scoffed. "See? More lies. Their real mother is Ashley Summers. She's in prison for drugs, but she's still their biological mother. That's science. You're just a woman with legal papers." She'd looked up their birth mother. She'd actually researched my children's history without my permission. "How did you even find that information?" My mother pulled out her phone, showing a file she'd made. "Private investigator. Cost me $3,000, but worth it to know who my grandchildren really are." She'd hired someone to dig into my children's past. "Look, I even found their birth father. He's in jail too. Theft and assault. Your kids come from criminals, but you pretend they're perfect." Lily was sobbing now. "Our first mommy is in jail?" My mother nodded eagerly. "For selling drugs. And your birth daddy hurt people. That's why you ended up in foster care. Because your real parents were bad people." I stood up, shaking with rage. "Get your things, kids. We're leaving." But my mother grabbed James's arm. "They should stay with me. I'm their real family. Blood family. You're just playing house with other people's children." James tried to pull away, but she held tight. "Grandma, you're hurting me." I removed her hand from my son. "Don't touch my children again." She laughed. "Your children? You mean Ashley's children that you bought because your broken body couldn't make any?" That's when I realized she'd been planning this. She'd waited until she was babysitting to destroy my children's sense of security. "You've been poisoning them against me." She shrugged. "I've been educating them. They should know their real heritage, not this fantasy you've created where you're their mother." Lily looked at me with huge tears. "If you're not our real mommy, do we have to leave?" My mother answered before I could. "Maybe someday your real mommy will get out of jail and want you back. Then you'll have to go with her because she made you." James started crying too. "I don't want to go to jail, Mommy." My mother had made them think their birth parents would come take them to prison. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. You're my kids. We're a family." My mother pulled out more papers. "Look, I printed their real birth certificates. See? Different last names. You're not even on them." She was showing my traumatized children documents that proved in her mind that I wasn't their mother. "Their real names are Madison and Tyler. You even stole their names from them." We'd changed their names because their birth mother had named them after drugs. She'd literally named them after her favorite pills. But my mother didn't mention that part. "Kids, get in the car. Now." I picked up James and took Lily's hand. My mother followed us. "Running away with the truth? Typical. You always were weak. Couldn't even have a baby like a real woman." I put my kids in their car seats while she kept talking. "I have grandparents' rights. I'll take you to court. Those kids need to know their real family." I turned to face her. Their real family is the people who love them, who adopted them, who raises them every day. She smirked. "Blood is blood. You can't change DNA. They'll always be Ashley and Jerome's kids. You're just a long-term babysitter." We drove home with both kids crying. I called my husband Daniel, who left work immediately. Then I called the child psychologist we'd been planning to work with. She did an emergency session that night. The damage my mother had done in one afternoon took months to undo. Lily had nightmares about being taken to jail. James started asking every day if he was really ours. They both became terrified that their birth parents would come steal them. The psychologist said my mother had traumatized them with information they weren't developmentally ready to process. We filed a restraining order. I carried James to the car while Lily walked behind us with her head down, not making a sound. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the car seat buckles fastened. James kept asking why Grandma said those things, and I kept telling him we'd talk at home, that everything would be okay. But my voice cracked on every word. Lily climbed into her booster seat without help and stared out the window the whole drive home. I called Daniel from the car and could barely get the words out through my crying. He said he was leaving work right that second and would meet us at home. The drive felt like it took forever, even though it was only 15 minutes. Both kids stayed quiet in the back seat, which somehow felt worse than if they'd been crying. When we got home, I put on their favorite movie, the one about the talking animals that usually made them laugh, but they just sat on the couch holding hands and staring at the screen without really watching. Daniel got there maybe 40 minutes later and found me in the kitchen gripping the counter, so hard my knuckles were white. He pulled me into a hug, and I finally let myself fall apart, sobbing into his chest while he rubbed my back. We stood there trying to figure out what the hell had just happened and how we were supposed to fix it. Daniel kept asking what exactly my mother had said, and I repeated it all, watching his face get redder and redder. He wanted to drive to her house right then and confront her, but I told him we needed to focus on the kids first. We had to help them understand before we dealt with her. Daniel pulled out his phone and started looking through the paperwork from our adoption agency. He found the list of recommended therapists they'd given us, the ones who specialized in adoption and child trauma. There was a woman named Bianca Medina, who had 3 pages of qualifications and reviews from other adoptive parents, saying she was amazing with kids. Daniel called her office and got her voicemail, but he left a message explaining it was an emergency, that our kids had just been traumatized with adoption information they weren't ready for. She called back within 20 minutes. Daniel put her on speaker, and I explained everything my mother had done and said. Bianca listened without interrupting, and then said she could see us that evening at 6 if we could make it to her office. We agreed immediately. Her office was in a building downtown with a bright blue door and a waiting room full of toys and picture books. Lily and James looked around nervously when we walked in, but Bianca came out right away and got down on their level. She had kind eyes and a soft voice, and she told them her office was a safe place where they could play and talk about anything. The kids followed her into her office, which had even more toys, including a whole bin of building blocks, and a dollhouse and art supplies covering one table. Bianca spent the first hour just letting them play while she sat on the floor with them. She'd ask gentle questions every now and then about what Grandma had told them, but mostly she just played alongside them. Lily built a house with the blocks, and then knocked it down, saying it was broken like her family. James played with toy cars and crashed them into each other over and over. After about 2 hours, Bianca asked Daniel and me to come back in while the kids kept playing. She explained that my mother had deliberately traumatized them by giving them information their brains weren't developed enough to process properly. She said at 6 and 4 years old they couldn't understand the complexity of adoption, birth parents, prison, or any of it. What they understood was that someone they trusted told them I wasn't their real mother, and that scary people might come take them away. Bianca said Lily and James now believed their birth parents would come steal them and take them to jail. That's what they'd processed from my mother's words. She said this kind of terror would take months of therapy to address properly, and we needed to start right away. She wanted to see both kids twice a week, and she'd work with us on how to talk to them about adoption in age-appropriate ways. The whole session cost $300, and our insurance would only cover half, but we didn't care. We'd pay anything to help them. That night, I put the kids to bed at their normal time, reading extra stories and staying in their rooms longer than usual. But around midnight, I heard Lily screaming. I ran to her room and found her sitting up in bed crying about police coming to take her away. She was shaking and sweating, and when I tried to hug her, she fought me at first, still half asleep and terrified. I climbed into her bed and held her while she sobbed into my shoulder. She kept asking if the police were coming and if she had to go to jail, and I kept telling her no, that she was safe, that nobody was taking her anywhere. James woke up from the noise and came running in crying too. He crawled into Lily's bed with us, and we all ended up in a pile on her floor with blankets and pillows. Neither kid would let me leave the room. Every time I tried to get up to use the bathroom or get water, they'd start crying again. So I stayed there all night, lying on the hard floor with both kids pressed against me. Daniel came in around 3 in the morning and lay down with us too. We all finally fell asleep like that, a family sleeping pile on Lily's bedroom floor. The next morning, I woke up stiff from sleeping on the floor, but both kids were still pressed against me, breathing steady and calm. Daniel had already gotten up to make breakfast, and I could smell coffee from the kitchen. I carefully moved James's arm off my chest and slid out from between them. Lily's eyes opened immediately, and she grabbed my hand. I told her I was just going to the bathroom and would be right back. She nodded but watched me until I left the room. When I came back, she was sitting up with James awake beside her. We all went downstairs together, and the kids ate pancakes while staying close to me at the table. Daniel had to go to work, but he kissed both kids extra long and promised he'd be home early. After he left, I got the kids ready for school and daycare. I'd already called both places the day before to explain what happened and give them my mother's photo with strict instructions that she wasn't allowed near my children. The school principal, Mrs. Hayes, had been very understanding and promised to alert all staff. The daycare director said the same thing. I dropped James off first, and he clung to my leg for 10 minutes before his favorite teacher coaxed him inside with the promise of playing with trucks. Then I took Lily to the school and walked her all the way to her classroom, even though she usually went in alone. Her teacher, Miss Rodriguez, gave me a sympathetic look and took Lily's hand. I watched through the classroom door window for a few minutes until Lily sat down at her desk and started coloring. The days passed slowly after that. Both kids had nightmares every single night. James wet the bed twice, which hadn't happened in over a year. Lily started asking constant questions about whether I was really her mom and if anyone could take her away. We had therapy sessions with Bianca 3 times that first week, and she gave us strategies for helping them feel safe again. On the 5th day after everything happened, I was at work trying to focus on my computer screen when my phone rang. It was Principal Hayes. My stomach dropped before she even spoke. She told me my mother had just shown up at the school during pickup time trying to get Lily from the playground. The office staff had stopped her, and she was currently in the principal's office. My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I told Mrs. Hayes I was leaving right now and would be there in 15 minutes. I grabbed my purse and ran to my car without even telling my boss I was leaving. I drove faster than I should have and kept picturing my mother grabbing Lily. When I got to the school, I parked crooked across 2 spots and ran inside. Mrs. Hayes was standing outside her office and pointed me toward the playground where Lily and James's classes were having outdoor time together. I found both my kids huddled together near the fence with a teacher standing guard beside them. Lily was crying and James looked terrified. I dropped to my knees and they both crashed into me. Lily was shaking and kept saying she saw Grandma's car. James buried his face in my shoulder. I picked them both up even though they were too big for that and carried them to my car. The teacher helped me get them buckled in their seats. Mrs. Hayes came out and handed me a written statement about what happened that I could give to our lawyer. She said my mother had argued with the office staff claiming she had rights to see her grandchildren and that I was being unreasonable. Security had to escort her off school property. I thanked Mrs. Hayes and drove straight to the daycare to pick up James even though he was already with me because Lily's school and his daycare had combined their outdoor time. I called Victor from the car and told him everything. He said this was exactly what we needed to file the emergency restraining order. He told me to bring the kids home and he'd have papers ready by this afternoon. When we got home, I put on a movie for the kids, but they wouldn't let me leave the room. I sat between them on the couch and they each held one of my hands. Daniel came home early and Victor arrived an hour later with a folder full of documents. The kids stayed in the living room with Daniel while Victor and I sat at the kitchen table. He had me write out everything my mother said that first day and everything that happened at the school. He said we'd file the emergency order today and a judge would review it within 24 hours. He explained that the school incident proved my mother was continuing to harass us and posed a threat to the children's well-being. I signed everywhere he pointed and he left to file the papers immediately. That night, putting the kids to bed took 2 hours. Lily kept asking if Grandma would come to our house. I promised her no and that we had locks on all the doors. James asked if Grandma could take him from the school tomorrow. I explained that the school wouldn't let that happen and that Victor was making sure Grandma had to stay away. Neither answer satisfied them, but eventually they fell asleep in Lily's bed together. Daniel and I lay in our own bed staring at the ceiling. He reached over and took my hand. The next afternoon, Victor called to say the temporary restraining order had been approved. A sheriff's deputy would serve my mother with papers that prohibited any contact with me or my children. The order would last until a full hearing in a few weeks where a judge would decide whether to make it permanent. I felt this huge relief wash over me knowing there was finally a legal barrier between my mother and my kids. But that relief lasted less than a day. The following morning, my sister Christina called me. I hadn't talked to her since before everything happened. She asked if it was true that I'd gotten a restraining order against our mother. I told her yes, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked if she could come over, and I said okay, because I was too tired to fight with anyone else. She showed up an hour later with 2 bags of groceries and hugged me at the door without saying anything about sides or family loyalty. We put the food away together while the kids watched TV in the living room, and she kept glancing at them like she was checking to make sure they were real. She told me our mother had called her saying I'd gotten a restraining order for no reason, and that I was being crazy and keeping her grandchildren away out of spite. I started to explain everything, but she held up her hand and said she didn't need to hear it because she already knew what kind of person our mother was. She'd spent her whole life watching our mother hurt people and then play the victim, and she wasn't falling for it anymore. She said our mother had called her a traitor for taking my side, and she told our mother she didn't care, because what she did to those kids were unforgivable. I started crying right there in the kitchen, and she hugged me again and said she'd come over twice a week to help with whatever I needed. She kept her word and showed up every Tuesday and Thursday, bringing groceries and playing with the kids while I caught up on work or just sat there trying to remember how to breathe. The week before the restraining order hearing, I couldn't sleep, and neither could Daniel. We lay in bed at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling, and he asked if I wanted him to go through the legal documents one more time. I snapped at him that I could handle it myself, and he sat up looking frustrated. He said he was just trying to help, and I said I knew, but these were my kids and my toxic mother, and I needed to be the one dealing with it. He got quiet, and then said that hurt, because they were his kids too, and this was destroying our family, not just mine. I told him he didn't understand because his mother wasn't the one who'd done this, and he said no, but he was watching his wife fall apart and felt completely useless. I started crying and said I was failing at protecting them from her, and he grabbed my hands and said I wasn't failing at anything. We ended up holding each other and crying together, and I admitted I was scared that if I let him take on more of the burden, I'd have to face how much this was destroying me. He said he'd rather we face it together than watch me carry it alone and break under the weight. The morning of the hearing, I threw up twice before we left the house. Victor met us at the courthouse and went over everything one more time while we sat on a bench in the hallway. My mother showed up with a lawyer in an expensive suit who looked at us like we were wasting everyone's time. We went into the courtroom and the judge called the case, and my mother's attorney stood up first. He said his client had simply been honest with her grandchildren about their biological origins, and that my reaction was extreme and unwarranted. He argued that children have a right to know the truth about where they come from, and that my mother was protecting that right. Victor stood up and presented Dr. Medina's written statement about the psychological damage both kids had suffered. He described Lily's nightmares about being taken to jail, and James's regression in potty training, and how they both now lived in fear that their birth parents would come steal them. He brought up the school incident where my mother had tried to see the kids despite being told to stay away. Then the judge asked me to testify, and I had to stand up there and repeat every awful thing my mother had said to my children. I had to say out loud how she'd told them I wasn't their real mother, and how she'd shown them documents about their birth parents being in prison. My mother sat there looking bored, like this was all a big inconvenience. Her attorney tried to make me sound like an overprotective parent who couldn't handle normal conversations about adoption. He asked if I'd ever planned to tell the children they were adopted, and I said yes, with professional help when they were old enough to understand it properly. He asked if the information my mother shared was factually accurate, and I said yes, but that doesn't make it appropriate to tell a 4-year-old and 6-year-old. He kept pushing about whether I was trying to hide the truth from them, and I kept explaining that timing and context matter when you're talking to small children about trauma. Then Victor asked my mother directly if she'd called me not their real mother in front of the children. She said yes, and added that it was technically true. Victor asked if she'd told them their birth parents were in prison, and she said yes because they deserved to know. He asked if she'd hired a private investigator to research the children's background without my permission, and she said yes, and she'd do it again. The judge's face changed while she was talking, and he looked disgusted. The judge said he'd heard enough and started talking about how deliberately giving young children information they're not developmentally ready to process constitutes psychological harm. He said it didn't matter if the information was factually accurate because the delivery was cruel and the timing was calculated to cause damage. He granted a 6-month restraining order prohibiting my mother from any contact with me or my children. My mother's face turned bright red, and she stood up and said something about grandparents' rights that the judge told her to save for another courtroom. She left muttering under her breath and shooting me looks that made my skin crawl. Victor said we'd won, but to expect her to file a lawsuit, and he was right. 2 days later, Victor called to say my mother's attorney had filed for grandparents' rights, claiming she was entitled to visitation with the kids. He said he'd expected this and already had our response prepared, but we were looking at months more of legal battles. I asked how much it would cost, and he gave me a number that made me feel sick. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table that night going through our finances, trying to figure out how we'd pay for everything. We'd already spent thousands on Victor's retainer and Dr. Medina's sessions, and now we were facing even more legal fees. We decided to cancel the vacation we'd been planning and put off fixing the leaky roof, and I went down to part-time at work, so I could be home more with the kids. Dr. Medina called me in for a meeting without the kids, and told me both of them were showing regression after the court hearing. Lily's nightmares had gotten worse, and she was waking up screaming 3 or 4 times a night. James wouldn't sleep in his own bed anymore, and followed me around the house, refusing to let me out of his sight. Dr. Medina said the legal process that was supposed to protect them was actually adding to their trauma because they could feel how stressed Daniel and I were. She recommended increasing therapy to 3 times a week, and I agreed, even though I had no idea how we'd afford it. I drove home feeling like the worst mother in the world because everything I was doing to protect my kids were somehow making things worse. Daniel suggested we see a couples counselor because he said we were barely talking anymore, except about legal strategy and the kids' therapy. I didn't want to add another expense, but he said our marriage falling apart wouldn't help anyone. We found someone who specialized in family crisis and went to our first session on a Thursday evening while Felipe watched the kids. The counselor asked how we were coping, and Daniel said he felt helpless watching me carry so much of the emotional burden. I admitted I was scared of falling apart if I let him take on more because then I'd have to face how much this was destroying me. The counselor said we needed to learn to share the weight instead of me holding it all while Daniel watched from the sidelines. She gave us homework about communicating our needs and supporting each other through the crisis instead of trying to be strong alone. 3 weeks after filing her lawsuit, my aunt showed up at our door with cards for the kids. She said my mother had asked her to deliver them and she didn't see the harm. I took the cards and closed the door and opened them to find pictures of Lily and James as babies with notes saying, "Grandma loves you and misses you." I called Victor immediately and he said this was a clear violation of the restraining order. He filed a motion for contempt of court and we had to go back to the courthouse again. The judge was angry and asked my mother if she understood what a restraining order meant. She said the cards were harmless and sent through a third party, so it didn't count. The judge said violating a restraining order is never harmless, and fined her $500 and warned her that any further violations would result in jail time. My mother left the courtroom looking furious, and I knew this wasn't over. Victor spent the next week preparing for my mother's deposition, and I sat through hours of him explaining what questions she'd face and how her answers would shape our case. He said depositions were discovery tools where attorneys could ask almost anything under oath, and my mother's lawyer couldn't protect her from questions about what she'd done to the kids. The deposition happened in Victor's office conference room with a court reporter typing every word while my mother sat across from Victor looking smug. Her attorney kept objecting to Victor's questions about her motivations, but Victor explained each time that understanding her beliefs about adoption was directly relevant to whether she should have access to my children. My mother testified that adopted children need connection to their blood heritage, and that I was denying them their true identity by not discussing their birth parents openly. She actually said the words, "Biological reality matters more than legal paperwork," while staring at me through the glass partition where I watched from Victor's office. Her attorney tried redirecting her answers to sound less harsh, but my mother kept going back to themes about blood family and real mothers versus adoptive ones. Victor asked if she understood that the children were 6 and 4 when she showed them information about their incarcerated birth parents, and my mother said ages didn't matter when truth was involved. She testified that she'd hired the private investigator because she had a right to know her grandchildren's real background, and that I'd been keeping secrets that belonged to the whole family. Victor asked if she'd considered consulting me or Daniel before sharing this information with the children, and my mother laughed, saying she didn't need permission to educate her own grandchildren. The deposition transcript was 53 pages of my mother explaining why she believed adopted children were fundamentally different from biological ones, and why she thought I was inadequate as their mother. Victor called me that evening and said her testimony was actually perfect for our case because it showed exactly the mindset that made her dangerous to the kids' well-being. He said judges didn't care about people's private beliefs until those beliefs caused them to harm children, and my mother had just spent 3 hours explaining precisely why she'd traumatized Lily and James on purpose. The therapy bills kept piling up while we waited for the guardian ad litem to complete her investigation, and I picked up extra freelance work doing graphic design at night after the kids went to bed. Daniel worked overtime at his engineering firm, and we barely saw each other except for quick conversations about legal strategy and the kids' latest therapy breakthroughs. Lily brought one of my mother's cards to her session with Bianca and held it in her lap for 20 minutes before asking if it was okay to miss Grandma, even though Grandma was mean. Bianca told her that people can have mixed feelings about someone who hurt them, and that missing a person doesn't mean you have to let them hurt you again. She used a metaphor about how some foods taste good but make your stomach hurt, and you can remember liking the taste while still choosing not to eat them anymore. Lily asked if that meant she was bad for missing Grandma, and Bianca explained that feelings aren't good or bad, they just are, and it's what we do with our feelings that matters. She helped Lily understand that she could remember good times with Grandma, while also knowing that Grandma made unsafe choices that hurt her. Lily asked if Grandma would ever stop being mean, and Bianca said some people don't change even when we want them to, which is why we have to protect ourselves by keeping distance. The session lasted 90 minutes instead of the usual 60, because Lily had so many questions about whether loving someone meant you had to let them be in your life. Bianca told me afterward that this was a major breakthrough, because Lily was finally processing her feelings instead of just being terrified, and that her ability to hold both love and hurt at the same time showed real emotional growth. 4 months after my mother's initial attack, I woke up at 6 in the morning and realized Lily hadn't come to our room once during the night. She'd been waking up with nightmares at least twice every night since everything happened, and I'd gotten so used to her crawling into bed between Daniel and me that I slept half awake listening for her footsteps. I walked to her room and found her sleeping peacefully with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, and I stood in her doorway crying, because this felt like the first real sign that healing was actually possible. Daniel found me there 10 minutes later and put his arm around me, and we watched our daughter sleep without nightmares for the first time in 16 weeks. I called Bianca later that day to tell her about the full night of sleep, and she said this was exactly the kind of progress she'd been hoping for, though she warned me that healing wasn't linear, and Lily might still have bad nights ahead. She reminded me that trauma recovery looked like a spiral where you circle back through difficult feelings, but at a higher level each time, and one good night didn't mean we were done with the hard work. But standing in that doorway watching Lily sleep peacefully felt like proof that my mother hadn't permanently broken my daughter, and I needed that proof more than I'd realized. James started asking different questions about his birth parents during his play therapy sessions with Bianca. Instead of asking if they were coming to take him away, or if he was bad like them, he wondered what they looked like, and if they liked the same foods he did. Bianca told me this curiosity was developmentally appropriate now that he wasn't terrified. We should work together on age-appropriate answers that satisfied his natural interest, without overwhelming him with information he couldn't process. We practiced responses in my own therapy sessions about how to acknowledge his birth parents as real people who existed without making them seem threatening or idealized. Bianca helped me understand that James needed to know his birth parents were human beings who struggled with problems they couldn't solve, not monsters who would steal him, or saints who gave him away because they didn't want him. She gave me language to use like, "Your birth mom had a sickness in her brain that made it hard for her to take care of anyone," instead of just saying she was in jail for drugs. James asked if his birth parents liked dinosaurs because he loved dinosaurs, and I told him I didn't know, but that lots of people like dinosaurs, so maybe they did. He asked if they had brown eyes like him, and I showed him the one photo from his adoption file that showed his birth mother's face partially, and he studied it for a long time before saying she looked sad. Bianca said this kind of concrete curiosity was healthy, and showed he was integrating his adoption story in a more balanced way, though she warned me to follow his lead and not volunteer information he hadn't asked for yet. Serafina Castillo called to schedule her home visit for the Guardian ad litem report, and I spent 2 days cleaning our house until Daniel told me to stop, because we needed to look like a real family, not a museum. She arrived on a Saturday morning with a laptop and a kind smile, and she spent 3 hours watching us make breakfast, play with the kids, and handle a minor tantrum when James didn't want to share his blocks with Lily. She asked the kids questions about their favorite things to do, and who they talked to when they felt sad or scared, and both of them mentioned Bianca without any prompting from us. She interviewed Daniel and me separately in the kitchen while the other parent played with the kids in the living room, asking about our marriage, our finances, our support system, and how we'd handled the trauma of the past 4 months. She asked Daniel if he'd ever questioned the adoption or wished the kids were biologically his, and he got emotional saying they were his kids in every way that mattered, and he'd fight anyone who suggested otherwise. She asked me about my relationship with my mother before this incident, and I admitted it had always been complicated, but I'd never imagined she'd deliberately hurt my children. Serafina took notes constantly and asked follow-up questions that showed she'd already done her research about the case. She interviewed Lily and James separately using play therapy techniques, and I watched through the window as my daughter showed her drawings of our family that included everyone except Grandma. After Serafina left, I collapsed on the couch, feeling like I'd just taken a final exam that would determine my children's entire future, and Daniel reminded me that our home and our family spoke for themselves. Serafina's report arrived 3 weeks later, and Victor called me immediately after reading it. She recommended denying my mother's grandparents' rights petition entirely, writing that my mother deliberately inflicted psychological harm on the children and showed no remorse or understanding of the damage she caused. The report detailed how both children exhibited symptoms of trauma directly related to my mother's actions, how our family had responded appropriately with professional help, and how my mother's continued boundary violations demonstrated she remained a danger to the children's well-being. Serafina wrote that while grandparents can play valuable roles in children's lives, this particular grandmother had proven herself unable to prioritize the children's emotional safety over her own beliefs about biological family. She noted that my mother's deposition testimony revealed a fixed mindset about adoption that made her fundamentally unsuitable for any contact with adopted children who needed security in their family structure. The report recommended that the court deny the petition without requiring supervised visitation or future reviews, stating that my mother's actions rose to the level of psychological abuse, and that no amount of supervision could make her safe for children she viewed as not truly belonging to their adoptive parents. Victor said this report was the strongest possible outcome, and that judges typically followed Guardian ad litem recommendations very closely, because these professionals were appointed specifically to represent the children's best interests. He warned me that my mother's attorney would try to discredit the report or argue that Serafina was biased, but that her detailed documentation and professional credentials made her very difficult to challenge. The final hearing for the grandparents' rights case got scheduled for a Tuesday morning 6 months after my mother's initial attack on my children. My mother's attorney presented 3 character witnesses who testified about what a loving grandmother she'd always been, describing birthday parties she'd thrown and school events she'd attended. They talked about how she'd helped with childcare and how much she loved Lily and James, painting a picture of a devoted grandmother being unfairly cut off from her grandchildren. But when Victor cross-examined the first witness, he asked if she knew my mother had hired a private investigator to research the children's birth parents, and the woman looked confused and said no. He asked the same question of each witness, and none of them knew about the private investigator or the file my mother had compiled, or the fact that she deliberately waited until she was alone with the children to share that information. Victor asked if they'd been present when my mother called me not their real mother in front of the children, and they all said they hadn't witnessed that. He asked if any of them had professional training in child development or adoption trauma, and they admitted they didn't. My mother's attorney tried to rehabilitate them by asking about her general character, but Victor had already shown that these witnesses had no idea what my mother had actually done, or why it was harmful. The judge looked unimpressed and thanked them for their time while making notes on his legal pad. When it was my turn to testify, Victor walked me through our adoption process and our plan to tell the kids about their background with professional help when they were developmentally ready. I explained how we'd always been honest that they were adopted and special and chosen, but that the details about their birth parents' incarceration and the reasons they'd been removed from their care were supposed to come later with therapeutic support. I described exactly what my mother said to the children that day, including her comments about me not being their real mother and their birth parents potentially coming to take them. I explained how Lily thought she'd be taken to jail, and how James regressed in his potty training and started having accidents at the school. I told the judge about the nightmares and the therapy bills and the 4 months it took before Lily slept through a single night. My mother's attorney tried to suggest I was exaggerating the children's reactions, but Victor had Dr. Medina's treatment notes documenting every session and every symptom. I looked at the judge and said my mother had taken a beautiful truth about my children being chosen and loved and turned it into a weapon that made them feel unwanted and temporary. I saw him taking detailed notes while my mother's attorney objected that I was being emotional rather than factual. Daniel testified after me about the financial and emotional toll on our family. He brought our bank statements showing thousands of dollars in legal fees and therapy costs, and he explained how our marriage had been strained by months of legal battles and trauma management. He described coming home from work to find me crying in the bathroom because I felt like I was failing our kids and having to comfort James through panic attacks about being taken away. He got emotional describing how James followed me around the house, terrified I'd disappear, refusing to go to daycare or even let me shower alone because he was scared someone would come take him while I was out of sight. He talked about the couples counseling we'd started because we were barely talking to each other anymore, except about legal strategy and therapy appointments. Daniel's voice broke when he said he'd never imagined that protecting our children from his mother-in-law would become a full-time job that consumed our lives and our savings. I saw my mother roll her eyes while Daniel talked about James's fear, and I watched the judge notice it too, because he looked directly at her with an expression that made her attorney put a hand on her arm. Victor asked Daniel if he believed my mother understood the harm she'd caused, and Daniel said no, because she'd continued to violate the restraining order and showed no remorse in her deposition. My mother's attorney objected that Daniel wasn't qualified to assess her mental state, but the judge overruled it, saying a father's observations about someone who'd traumatized his children were absolutely relevant to the case. Dr. Medina took the witness stand wearing a navy suit and carrying a thick folder of session notes. Victor asked her to explain her credentials, and she listed her PhD in child psychology, her specialization in adoption trauma, and 15 years working with foster and adoptive families. She opened the folder and pulled out documentation from every single session with Lily and James over the past 6 months. Victor asked her to describe the psychological impact of my mother's actions, and she said the children presented with symptoms consistent with acute trauma, including nightmares, regression in developmental milestones, attachment anxiety, and intrusive thoughts about abandonment. She explained that my mother had weaponized information the children weren't ready to process, and delivered it in the most harmful way possible by suggesting their birth parents would reclaim them, and that I wasn't their real mother. Dr. Medina said this was psychologically equivalent to abuse, because it deliberately destroyed the children's sense of safety and belonging within their family unit. My mother's attorney tried to argue that telling children the truth about their origins couldn't be abuse, but Dr. Medina cut him off, saying there's a massive difference between age-appropriate adoption education and what my mother did. She said responsible adoption disclosure happens gradually with professional support, and focuses on the child being chosen and loved, not on birth parents being criminals or adoptive parents being fake. Victor asked if the children were still showing signs of trauma, and Dr. Medina nodded, saying that while they'd made significant progress, both kids still exhibited anxiety around separation, and Lily still occasionally asked if I was really keeping her forever. She said any contact with my mother would undo months of therapeutic work and re-traumatize them by confirming their fear that the person who hurt them could access them again. The judge asked Dr. Medina directly if she believed contact with the grandmother would harm the children, and she said absolutely without hesitation. The judge closed his folder and looked directly at my mother before announcing his ruling from the bench. He said that while grandparents can play valuable and important roles in children's lives, the court's primary concern must always be the best interests of the children themselves. He reviewed the evidence, including Dr. Medina's testimony, the documented therapy sessions, the school reports showing behavioral changes, and the restraining order violation. He said my mother had deliberately inflicted psychological harm on 2 young children by disclosing sensitive adoption information in a traumatic manner designed to undermine their relationship with their adoptive mother. He noted that my mother showed no remorse in her deposition and continued to insist that blood relations mattered more than the legal and emotional bonds of adoption. The judge said my mother's actions demonstrated she was a danger to the children's mental health and emotional well-being. He denied her petition for grandparents' rights entirely and extended the restraining order for another 2 years. He said the children deserved to heal in a safe environment without the threat of further psychological abuse from someone who viewed their adoption as illegitimate. My mother shot up from her chair so fast it clattered backward against the floor. She started yelling that the court was denying her constitutional rights and that blood family matters more than legal paperwork. She said I'd brainwashed everyone, including the judge, and that her grandchildren needed to know their real heritage. The judge banged his gavel and told her to sit down immediately, but she kept going, saying she'd appeal this decision and take it all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. She pointed at me and said I was stealing children who didn't belong to me, and that someday Lily and James would realize I'd kept them from their real family. The judge warned her she was in contempt of court, and my mother actually laughed, saying she didn't care, because this whole proceeding was a joke designed to protect my feelings instead of the children's rights. The bailiff approached her and my mother shoved him away, which was apparently the final straw. The judge ordered her removed from the courtroom and threatened her with jail time if she violated the restraining order again. 2 bailiffs grabbed her arms and started walking her toward the door while she screamed about grandparents' rights and blood being thicker than water. I watched her being dragged out, still yelling, and felt this enormous weight lift off my shoulders, knowing she couldn't legally force her way back into our lives anymore. Daniel squeezed my hand and I realized I was shaking, but it was relief, not fear. That evening we ordered pizza and had Christina and Felipe over for a quiet celebration at home. The kids were running around the living room playing with their toys, while the adults sat in the kitchen drinking wine and talking about the hearing. Lily came over and climbed into my lap, asking why everyone seemed so happy today. I told her the judge made a decision that meant bad grandma couldn't bother us anymore, and that our family was safe. James wandered over holding his favorite truck and asked if bad grandma was gone forever. Daniel picked him up and said she wasn't allowed to contact us or come near us for a very long time. Lily looked up at me with those big eyes and asked if bad grandma could hurt us anymore, and I finally got to say no with complete certainty. She hugged me tight and said good, because she didn't want anyone making mommy cry again. Christina started tearing up and Felipe cleared his throat, looking away. We ate pizza on the floor with the kids and watched their favorite movie, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt like we could actually breathe without waiting for the next legal bomb to drop. 2 weeks later, Victor called saying my mother's attorney had sent a letter. My stomach dropped, thinking she'd filed an appeal, but Victor said it was actually an offer. My mother was proposing to pay for all the kids' therapy costs if I would allow supervised visits at a neutral location. Victor said accepting any money from her could complicate things legally, because it might be seen as me agreeing she had some legitimate claim to the children. He advised refusing the offer entirely because no amount of money was worth risking my children's mental health or creating any legal ambiguity about her rights. I didn't even have to think about it. I told Victor to send back a firm no and make it clear that my mother had no place in our lives regardless of what she offered to pay. Daniel agreed completely when I told him that night. We'd gone into debt fighting her legally and paying for therapy, but we'd do it again 1,000 times rather than let her near Lily and James. Lily started talking about adoption at the school in healthier ways, according to her teacher. She told her classmates she was special because her mommy and daddy chose her instead of just getting stuck with whatever baby came out. Her teacher called me to say Lily seemed much more confident lately and had stopped having meltdowns during class. She said Lily had even done a show and tell presentation about adoption, where she explained that some kids grow in their mommy's tummy and some kids grow in their mommy's heart. The nightmares had stopped completely for over a month now, and Lily was sleeping through the night in her own bed. She still came to our room sometimes, but it was normal kid stuff, not the terror-induced panic from before. Her teacher said she'd made huge progress and seemed secure in her family identity again. James started playing independently for longer periods without needing constant physical contact with me. He'd spend 20 or 30 minutes building block towers or playing with his trucks without checking to make sure I was still in the room. Dr. Medina said this was a major sign that his attachment was becoming secure again after the trauma had disrupted it. He still had moments of anxiety, especially during transitions like going to daycare or bedtime, but they were getting less intense and less frequent. Dr. Medina said he was right on track developmentally now, and that the regression we'd seen was reversing as he felt safer. She was really proud of how much work he'd done in therapy considering how young he was. 6 months after the final court ruling, Dr. Medina said both kids were ready to reduce therapy to monthly check-ins instead of weekly sessions. She said they'd come incredibly far from those first terrified sessions, where Lily thought she'd be taken to jail and James wouldn't let me out of his sight. She told me and Daniel that we'd handled an incredibly difficult situation with love and appropriate boundaries, which gave the kids exactly what they needed to heal. She said most families facing this kind of deliberate trauma inflicted by a family member struggled to maintain unity, but we'd protected our children while helping them process complex emotions about their adoption and their grandmother. Dr. Medina said she was proud of how far we'd all come and that our family was going to be just fine.